There is a pain that does not bleed, but consumes. A wound that is not seen, but never heals. In the barren heart of Texas, where the wind carries broken promises and the sun burns both dreams and dry land, some men learn that love can be crueler than any bullet. Thomas Mitchell watched the horizon through the dusty window of his cabin. The farm that once prospered now scattered its bleached bones across the valley as silent reminders of better times. The fallen fences stretched like open scars across the landscape, and cattle had long been sold to pay off debts that grew like weeds after the rain. But it wasn't financial ruin that kept his eyes fixed on the far line where the earth met the sky. It was the stubborn hope of seeing a familiar silhouette emerge among the heat waves. 3 months had passed since Margaret left. 3 months since she held the newborn baby in her arms and mumbled words he pretended not to hear. The child cried in the morning, in the afternoon, during the long and sweltering nights. Thomas had learned to recognize every kind of crying: hunger, discomfort, fear, but he never managed to learn how to silence the very cry that echoed in his empty chest. The town of Cedar Creek was a 2-hour ride away, but Thomas only went there when absolutely necessary. People whispered as he passed, some with pity, others with judgment. The story had spread like wildfire on the dry prairie. Margaret had run off with the cloth merchant, leaving behind a husband and a 2-month-old baby. What no one knew, what Thomas would never tell, were the words she had whispered before she left, that the boy might not be his. The baby now slept in the makeshift crib Thomas had made out of old wood from the fence. Small, clenched fists, soft breathing, oblivious to the abandonment that surrounded him. Thomas approached slowly, as he did every morning, looking for some familiar trace in the child's face. Her eyes were dark like Margaret's, but the shape of her nose, the line of her forehead, they were mysteries that time would reveal or hide forever. The milk of the only cow that was left was becoming scarce. Thomas knew that he would soon need to make a decision. Sell the property and leave for the city where he could work and find a wet nurse. Or accept the proposal of the Wilson couple, who could not have children and had offered the boy a home. Both options meant admitting defeat, acknowledging that he could not care for the child on his own, who was perhaps his only real connection to Margaret. During the day, Thomas tried to keep busy. He repaired what could still be fixed, took care of the few animals that remained, planted what the parched land still accepted. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky as red as blood, loneliness descended upon the farm like a silent storm. It was at these times that he found himself talking to the wind, whispering questions that only Margaret could answer. The baby awoke with a high-pitched cry, and Thomas rushed to warm him with milk. Her hands, calloused from hard work, trembled slightly as she held the makeshift bottle. The boy calmed down as he felt the food, small eyes opening to meet the tired face of the man who had become his only certainty in the uncertain world of the valley. In that moment, Thomas made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. I wouldn't sell the farm. He would not give the boy to the Wilsons. If Margaret ever returned, she would find her home still standing and her son still waiting for her. And if she never returned, at least the child would grow up knowing the land that one day he could call his own, regardless of who his real father was. The night wind brought the smell of distant rain, a rare promise in that dry season. Thomas rocks the baby until he falls asleep again, then goes out to the porch. Sitting in the rocking chair he had made for Margaret, he watched the stars appear one by one in the infinite sky. Somewhere, under those same stars, she was living a new life. But here, on the abandoned farm, time had stopped on the day she left, and Thomas Mitchell, a prosperous farmer without a farm, father of a son who might not have been his, would continue to wait. Because some wounds, he had learned, do not heal with time. They just become part of who we are, like scars that tell stories that we prefer to forget but can never completely erase. The rain came 3 days later, like an unexpected blessing that washed away the accumulated dust and brought the smell of wet earth that Thomas had forgotten existed. The baby slept more peacefully with the soft sound of drops on the metal roof, and for the first time in weeks, the farm didn't seem completely dead. Thomas took advantage of the cool morning to fix the holes in the chicken coop. The only chicken left, a stubborn, ill-tempered bird that Margaret had named Prudence, scratched contentedly in the newly formed mud. It was strange how life went on, even when everything seemed to have stopped. The hen laid her eggs, the baby grew, the sun rose every morning. Nature cared not for the broken hearts of men. The sound of hooves in the mud made Thomas raise his head. A lone rider approached along the road, moving slowly in the light rain. Thomas recognized the silhouette before he could even see the face. It was Samuel Harrison, the sheriff of Cedar Creek, an honest man who had been a friend of the family in the best of times. Samuel dismounted near the porch, taking off his wet hat and shaking off the water. Her eyes, normally gentle, carried a seriousness that made Thomas's stomach twitch. Sheriff's visits rarely brought good news, especially for men in situations like yours. The baby woke up to the noise, starting to cry the way Thomas already knew so well. It was the cry of hunger, sharp and insistent. Thomas ran inside, prepared the bottle with trembling hands, trying not to think about what Samuel might want. When he returned to the porch, the sheriff was watching the ruined farm with a melancholy expression. Samuel accepted the coffee Thomas offered, even though it was warm and bitter. They were silent for a few minutes, two men who had learned that sometimes words were insufficient to carry the weight of life. The baby sucked the bottle, desperately hungry, oblivious to the tension that hung in the humid morning air. The conversation, when it finally began, was about simple things: the weather, the rain, the state of the roads. But Thomas knew that Samuel had not ridden 2 hours in the rain to talk about the weather. There was something behind that visit, something the sheriff was mustering up the courage to say. It was only when the baby fell asleep again that Samuel finally got to the point. There was news about Margaret. Someone had seen her in El Paso, working at a boarding house. She was fine, it seemed, but she was not alone. The cloth merchant had left for Mexico a few weeks after they arrived in the city, leaving her penniless and without protection. Thomas felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't exactly a relief to know that she was alive and safe, nor was it satisfaction in knowing that the man for whom she had abandoned everything had also abandoned her. It was something more complex, a mixture of pain and hope that he couldn't name. Samuel continued talking, but Thomas could barely hear the words. Her mind was on El Paso, trying to imagine Margaret serving food to strangers, sleeping in a small, stuffy room far from the farm that had been her home for 5 years. Did she think about him sometimes? Was she thinking about the baby she had left behind, or had he managed to completely erase that life from memory? The sheriff was preparing to leave when he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was other news. The cloth merchant had family in Cedar Creek, a sister who had arrived in town a few weeks ago looking for her brother, a woman named Elizabeth with a small baby in her arms and stories about broken promises. Thomas felt the world spin slightly. Another baby, another abandoned woman. The pattern repeated itself like a cruel echo through the desert. How many lives had the merchant destroyed on his journey? How many families had been torn apart by their empty promises? After Samuel left, Thomas stood alone on the porch, watching the rain subside until it became just an occasional drip from the roof. The baby slept peacefully in his arms, soft breathing warming the chest of the man who had become his entire world. It didn't matter who the child's biological father was. Thomas was the one who was there, the one who woke up during the nights, the one who warmed the milk, the one who hummed out-of-tune songs to calm the crying. But now there was a new question weighing on his heart. Margaret was in El Paso, alone and in need of help. And there was another woman in Cedar Creek, also abandoned, also struggling to survive with a baby in her arms. Thomas looked at the ruined farm, at the land it barely produced, at the lonely life that had become his reality. For the first time since Margaret left, Thomas Mitchell began to consider that perhaps her story wasn't over the day she disappeared over the horizon. Perhaps there were other chapters waiting to be written, other choices that needed to be made. And maybe, just maybe, the love he felt didn't have to die with abandonment. The rain stopped completely as the sun began to set. Thomas entered the quiet house, put the baby in the crib, and lit the lamp. There were letters to write, decisions to make, a journey that might need to be started. The valley was still empty, but his heart, for the first time in months, was beginning to fill with something that looked dangerously like hope. The decision came with the dawn, clear as the golden light that spread through the valley, still damp. Thomas packed only what was necessary: clothes for himself and the baby, the little food he had left, and the measly amount he had stored in an old tin can behind the stove. The farm would be left behind, at least for now. The trip to Cedar Creek took 3 hours with the baby. Thomas had improvised a sling out of an old blanket, keeping the child close to his chest as he rode slowly down the muddy road. Each of the boy's cries echoed through the empty landscape, reminding him that he was not just carrying a child, but the entire responsibility of a life that depended completely on him. The city had grown since his last visit. New buildings rose on the main street, and the movement of people and carts gave the place an air of prosperity that contrasted with the desolation of his farm. Thomas went directly to Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, where Samuel had said Elizabeth was staying. He found her in the small back garden, hanging diapers on the improvised clothesline. She was a young woman, perhaps 25, with brown hair tied up in a simple bun, and eyes that carried the same tiredness that Thomas saw in the mirror every morning. The baby, who slept in a wicker basket next to her feet, appeared to be the same age as Thomas's son. Elizabeth looked up when she heard footsteps in the wet grass. There was distrust in her gaze, the kind of caution that single women learn to develop when the world becomes a dangerous place. But when she saw the baby in Thomas's sling, her expression softened slightly. Thomas introduced himself bluntly. He told about Margaret, about the cloth merchant, about the painful connection that united them, even though they were strangers. Elizabeth listened in silence, her hands interrupting the work, to lean on the clothesline. When he finished, she simply nodded, as if she already knew that this conversation would come eventually. Elizabeth's story was familiar in its cruelty. The merchant had arrived in his hometown in Colorado, promising a new life, a prosperous future in distant lands. She had believed, sold everything she owned, followed the man she swore to love, until she discovered, too late, that he collected women as he collected goods, to use and discard when they no longer served his purposes. They talked all morning, two castaways comparing the wreckage of their lives. Thomas's baby woke up hungry, and Elizabeth offered help with the naturalness of someone who fully understood the difficulties of caring for a child alone. Their movements were efficient, practical, born of necessity and desperation. It was during lunch at the boarding house that Thomas made the proposal that had been forming in his mind since the conversation with Samuel. It wasn't love, it wasn't passion, it wasn't the kind of union that poets sang about in their ballads. It was something simpler and perhaps more honest, a partnership based on mutual need and a shared understanding of pain. Elizabeth considered the proposal with the seriousness she deserved. Thomas offered a home, land to farm, protection for her and her son. In return, she offered care for the babies, work in the house, companionship in the solitude that had become his life. There were no romantic promises. There were no grandiose declarations. Just two injured people recognizing that perhaps they could heal better together than apart. The decision was not made that day, nor the next. Elizabeth needed time to think, to weigh the options that a woman alone with a baby had in the harsh world of the West. Thomas waited, splitting his time between the boarding house and the streets of Cedar Creek, watching the life of the town continue around him, while his own life remained suspended between the past and an uncertain future. It was during one of these walks that Thomas met Father Martinez in the small church at the end of the main street. The old man had met Margaret, had blessed their marriage years ago when there was still hope and happiness in their hearts. Now, Thomas found himself confessing his fears and doubts to a man who listened without judgment. The priest offered no easy answers or cheap absolutions. Instead, it reminded Thomas that life rarely developed according to the plans we make. Sometimes, he said, grace came disguised as necessity, and true love was born not of passion, but of the daily choice to care for one another, even when we didn't feel like it. On the evening of the third day, Elizabeth gave her answer. She was willing to try, not out of love, but for something that might be more lasting, the hope that two people destroyed by the same man could find a way to rebuild their lives together. It was a small beginning, fragile like the plants that sprouted in the parched earth after the rain. Thomas felt something move in his chest, something that wasn't exactly joy, but it wasn't despair either. It was the strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, his story would not end with abandonment and loneliness. There were still chapters to be written, choices to be made, a new life to be built on the rubble of the old. They set out from Cedar Creek the next morning, 2 adults and 2 infants in a borrowed wagon, following the road that led back to the valley where the Mitchell farm was waiting for a second chance. The sun was up, the air still carried the smell of recent rain, and for the first time in months, Thomas Mitchell didn't look at the horizon expecting to see Margaret appear. He looked forward to the path he had chosen to follow. The first few months were like learning to walk again after a fall that broke all the bones. Elizabeth worked alongside Thomas, rebuilding not only the farm, but also a routine that made sense to 4 people who had become a family by choice, not by blood or passion. The mornings began before dawn. Elizabeth took care of the 2 babies while Thomas milked the cow and checked on the few animals he had been able to buy with the money she had brought from her savings. They didn't talk much during those first hours, but there was a quiet efficiency in their movements, like 2 musicians learning to play the same song without having to look at each other. Thomas's baby was growing, his eyes becoming more alert, his small hands beginning to reach for objects with curiosity. Elizabeth treated the child as if it were her own, without difference or favoritism. Their own son, Charlie, was only a few days younger, and the 2 boys looked like twins when they slept side by side in the double crib Thomas had built. It was on a hot September afternoon that the letter arrived. The postman, an elderly man who was making the route between the isolated farms, handed the envelope with the seriousness of someone who carries bad news. The name in the handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret had written it. Thomas held the letter for a long time before opening it. Elizabeth continued to cook dinner, but he could feel her tension in the stiffer movements, in the way she avoided looking in her direction. The letter was short, written on cheap paper from a boarding house in El Paso. Margaret asked for forgiveness. She said she was sick, penniless, regretting all the choices she had made. More importantly, she asked to return home. Thomas read the letter 3 times before placing it on the table. Elizabeth turned from the stove, and they looked at each other for a long moment. There was no accusation in his eyes, no fear, just a silent question he didn't know how to answer. That night, after the babies had fallen asleep, Thomas and Elizabeth sat on the porch and talked until dawn. It wasn't an argument or a fight. It was an honest conversation between 2 people who had learned that life rarely offers simple choices between right and wrong. Elizabeth said she would understand if he wanted to fetch Margaret. She had always known that this possibility existed, that Thomas's heart still bore scars that only his first wife could heal or completely reopen. She could leave, take Charlie, and find another place to start over. Thomas listened, but when it was his turn to speak, the words that came out surprised him. He didn't want Elizabeth to leave. He didn't want to undo the life they had built together, no matter how fragile and imperfect it was. Margaret had made her choice months ago when she chose to leave without looking back. Now it was his turn to make his. But there was one issue they could not ignore. Margaret was sick and alone. As much as she had caused her pain, as much as her departure had destroyed the life Thomas had planned, she was still a person who needed help. And Thomas had been raised believing that some obligations transcended love or hurt. The solution came from Elizabeth, and her simplicity left Thomas both amazed and grateful. They would go together to pick up Margaret, not as a repentant ex-husband, but as people who understood what it was like to be lost and need a second chance. They would bring Margaret back, not to start the marriage again, but so that she could recover and find her own way. The trip to El Paso took a week. Thomas, Elizabeth, and their 2 babies, in a wagon loaded with supplies and the quiet determination to do what was right, regardless of how easy it was. The desert stretched around them like a sea of sand and stone, and during the cold nights under the endless stars, Thomas wondered if he was doing the right thing or just prolonging an agony that would be better ended at once. They found Margaret in the cheapest boarding house in town, a place that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. She was thinner, paler, but her eyes still carried the beauty that had captured Thomas's heart years ago. When she saw Elizabeth and the babies, her expression went through a series of emotions: surprise, shame, gratitude, and something that could have been relief. Margaret asked no questions about who Elizabeth was or why there was a stranger taking care of her son. Perhaps he was too ill to care, or perhaps he intuitively understood that he had lost the right to ask certain questions when he chose to abandon his family. She simply accepted the help with the humility of someone who had learned that pride was a luxury she could not afford to have. The return trip was different from the outward trip. Margaret regained strength slowly, helping Elizabeth with the babies when she could, participating in camp chores when her health permitted. There were no attempts at romantic reconciliation, no drama or emotional entreaties. There were only 3 adults who had experienced enough loss to understand that sometimes compassion was more important than justice. When they arrived at the farm, Thomas made a final decision. He built a small cabin at the back of the property where Margaret could live with dignity while she fully recovered. She would work on the farm, contribute to her livelihood, but there would be no pretense that the lost years could be recovered, or that the broken hearts could be glued together exactly as they were before. It was an imperfect solution to an impossible situation. But as he watched Elizabeth lull the 2 babies to bed, as he watched Margaret help with the household chores without trying to claim a place that was no longer his, Thomas realized that perhaps perfection was less important than peace. The valley was still barren, the farm was still struggling to thrive, but there was life there now, not the life he had dreamed of, but a life that worked, that nurtured, that offered hope for the future. And perhaps, Thomas thought, as he watched the sunset paint the sky golden, this was the most important lesson the desert could teach, that survival sometimes required completely reinventing what it meant to be alive. 2 years had passed when Thomas finally understood that some wounds do not need to heal completely for us to stop feeling pain. They just become part of the inner landscape, like scars that tell stories without embittering the present. The farm had prospered in a way he never imagined possible, not with the grandeur of old dreams, but with the solidity of something built on realistic foundations. Elizabeth had become more than a working partner. She was his companion in the purest sense of the word. They shared the responsibilities, the worries, the small joys of each day well lived. The boys now ran around the courtyard with the unbridled energy of 2-year-olds. Thomas found that it didn't matter which of the 2 carried his blood. They both called him Dad. They both ran into his arms when they got hurt. They both fell asleep listening to his clumsy stories about cowboys and desert adventures. Fatherhood, he learned, was built of everyday moments, not genetics. Margaret had made a full recovery, both physically and in spirit. He worked on the farm with the dedication of someone who had learned to value stability, but he maintained his independence in the small cabin that had become his home. There were moments of tension, of course, looks that lasted a second longer, shared memories that came without warning, but there was also a strange peace between them, as if they had all finally accepted that the past could not be changed, only understood. It was on a spring morning, when the first wildflowers were beginning to sprout in the land that had remained barren for so long, that Thomas received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed, middle-aged man stepped out of a fancy carriage and introduced himself as El Paso's lawyer. It brought news about the cloth merchant. The man had died in a bar fight in Mexico, leaving behind not only the women he had abandoned, but also a small fortune hidden in various bank accounts. The lawyer was tracking down his victims to distribute the money as a form of posthumous reparation. Margaret and Elizabeth were entitled to a considerable sum each. Thomas watched as the two women received the news with completely different reactions. Elizabeth seemed stunned, unable to process that her financial situation had changed dramatically overnight. Margaret just nodded, as if she always knew that fate would find a way to balance the books. That night, gathered around the dinner table, they discussed what money meant to each other. Elizabeth could leave, buy her own property, start a completely independent life. Margaret could travel, see the world, start over anywhere she chose. The possibilities were endless for both, but when the next morning came, neither of them had packed their bags. Elizabeth said she had found something on the farm that money couldn't buy, a chosen family, a place where she truly belonged. The money would be used to improve the property, ensure education for the boys, create a safer future for all. Margaret was more direct in her choice. He would use part of the money to build his own house in the neighboring city, where he could open a small business. It would be close enough to see the boys grow up, to maintain the bonds that had formed during their recovery, but far enough away to allow Thomas and Elizabeth to build their lives without the shadow of the past. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and melancholy when Margaret left a few months later. She visited them regularly, brought gifts for the boys, helped during harvest seasons. She had become something neither of them expected, a friend, an extended part of the family, someone who shared the story but did not interfere in the present. In the fall of that year, Thomas and Elizabeth were married in a simple ceremony at the Cedar Creek Church. It was not a marriage born of the sweeping passion of fairy tales, but of something perhaps more enduring, mutual respect, true companionship, and the kind of love that grows slowly, like hardy plants in arid soil. The boys served as pages, stumbling over the small suits and drawing laughter from the small congregation. Margaret was present, sitting discreetly in the back seats, smiling with the grace of someone who had found peace in seeing others happy. On their wedding night, Thomas and Elizabeth sat on the farm's porch, watching the stars appear in the endless Texas sky. The boys slept peacefully in the next room, and the property around them breathed with the satisfaction of a well-kept place. There was something profoundly right in that moment, Thomas realized, not the correction of plans that go exactly as expected, but the correction of things that find their natural place in spite of all obstacles. Like rivers that meet the sea, even when mountains rise in their path. Elizabeth took his hand, and they stayed that way for a long time, two survivors who had learned that sometimes the happy ending wasn't about getting what you wanted, but discovering that what you had was enough. Years later, when the boys were adults and had families of their own, Thomas still remembered that night as the moment he finally understood a simple truth about life, that true love wasn't always about passion or destiny. Sometimes it was about choosing to take care of each other, day in and day out, even when we didn't feel like it. It was about building something lasting in the ruins of what had been lost. The valley was still arid, the sun still punished the dry land, the wind still carried promises that were not always fulfilled. But there was life there, abundant and real life, built not on romantic dreams, but on the daily decision to turn survival into hope, loneliness into community, scars into wisdom. And when Thomas Mitchell looked at the horizon now, he was no longer waiting for someone to show up to save his life. He had learned to save her on his own, one day at a time, with the help of people who had chosen to stay even when leaving would be easier. In the end, he discovered that this was the only salvation that really mattered, the one that grew from the inside out, like desert flowers that bloom after the most unlikely rain. If Thomas Mitchell's journey through pain, forgiveness, and rebuilding touched your heart as much as it touched ours, you can't miss the next stories of courage and redemption from the American Wild West that we have prepared for you. Subscribe to the channel to follow other narratives about men and women who braved the arid wilderness, not only of the Texan landscape, but also of the wounded hearts themselves.